All right, welcome everybody. Happy Earth Day. This is Galen Barbos with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm joined here by my colleagues, Sydney Forrester and Naeem Dargouth. Our other colleague and co-author, Eric O'Shaughnessy, I think is out there as well, though we decided not to let Eric talk today, so he'll just be an observer. I see folks are still joining, but let me just kind of go over some of the standard housekeeping items before we begin. So all of you out there are in listen-only mode. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and you should see a Q&A box somewhere on your screen. And so I would encourage you to please enter in questions along the way. Naeem will be kind of collating them as we go. And if there are kind of simple kind of logistical questions, he can answer them on the fly, but otherwise we'll try to get through as many of them as we can at the end. So please do insert your questions as we go. We're recording this presentation and we'll be posting it online in the next couple of days. If you'd like a copy of the presentation slides, I'm not sure if we'll actually be posting these specific slides. Your better bet, though, is just to download the report itself, which is a slide deck and is essentially just a somewhat expanded and more detailed version of the slides that we'll be running through verbally here today. So I think that's kind of pretty much it in terms of the standard preamble. I did want to, before getting into this report itself, just kind of give a little bit of background and context about this study and about how it fits into the larger body of work that Berkeley Lab is undertaking. So the study that we're talking about today is essentially an annual tracking report. This year's edition updates last year's report with an additional year's worth of data extending through 2019, and also a fairly substantially expanded scope of different trends. This report here is really a descriptive analysis. It's primarily intended at just kind of laying out the key kind of foundational trends. There are some spots within the presentation where we'll allude to kind of likely or possible causes for some of the trends that we're seeing. But that's not really the primary intent of this document. Really, this is just to kind of lay out the facts as they are. And then through some separate studies that are ongoing, we're really trying to kind of dig into those trends in a deeper, more analytical way to kind of really understand what some of the drivers are. In addition to this report, we've also issued an online data visualization tool that incorporates all of the data that we're presenting here, or much of it, and essentially allows users to kind of slice and dice it in different ways than what we've been able to do within the report, and zoom down into kind of finer levels of geographical scales down to the county and tract level. In addition, we've been offering technical assistance to organizations that are working on issues related to solar energy access and equity. We'll be putting on a webinar in a couple weeks, May 6th, I believe, where we'll be talking a little bit more about those technical assistance opportunities and the kinds of assistance that we're able to offer. So any folks who are listening in here who would like to tune into that technical assistance oriented webinar, just send us a chat and we'll make sure that you're on the announcement list for that. And then last, I just wanted to note that there's this website at the bottom of the screen, solardemographics.lbl.gov. That's kind of the clearinghouse website where all of our work in this broad area is housed. So that's where you can find a copy of this report, the webinar recording, and all of the other related stuff that I just mentioned. So with that, let's get going. If I can advance the slides here. There we go. All right, so just first to give a little bit of an overview of the material that we'll be presenting here. So the first major piece is section 2, which focuses on income related trends. And then section 3 is where we describe all sorts of other kind of socioeconomic indicators for solar adopters. And that material is really wholly new within this edition of the report. I'm also just note that there are a couple of grayed out items there. Those are topics that we probably won't have time to get to during the presentation here today, but I just want to mention them here because they're part of the report itself. So first, I wanted to just quickly give a sense of the underlying data that's used in this report and that underlies a lot of the derivative analysis that we do in this area. So there are two major kind of pieces or two major elements of data. There are, on the left-hand side, are our sources of PV system data and street addresses. That primarily comes from our annual Tracking the Sun report and the associated data collection process. And then we've supplemented that with some additional PV system addresses obtained through from a couple companies, BuildZoom and Ohm Analytics, who compile data from building permitting agencies. So together we have about just under 2 million PV addresses. We then marry that data with data on income and other socioeconomic indicators based on the individual address level. That primarily comes from Experian. So Experian, we send them the addresses, they return to us all of these, income and other demographic attributes. It's two things that are important to note there. First, that those attributes are defined at the household level. So as opposed to census data, which is defined typically at more aggregated spatial scales, we're working with data that is specific to the individual address. Much of that data, though, is estimate. So, Experian has a model that they use to estimate household level incomes based on a whole variety of variables, some of which may be defined at the household level. And so just want to be clear about that. And then we do use, to some extent, some census data and some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for several aspects of the analysis where we're comparing PV adopters to the broader population. So let's see, just real quick to give a sense of our sample size and the market coverage. On the left, we show our sample size by year, along with the percentage of all US residential systems in the sample. And you can see that, in total, we've got a little over 80% of the US market represented within our sample. And that's been fairly stable year over year. And then on the right, the map shows the geographical distribution of the 2019 systems in our sample. And as you can see, we've got pretty broad geographical coverage, though there are a few states where we're missing a decent chunk of the market. Later on in the presentation, where we show state level results, we typically will only show states where that meet certain minimum sample size and market coverage thresholds. So when you see some of the state level results later, if there are particular states that are missing, that is just because we don't have enough data for those states. One other important point that I'll note here is that our sample is quite heavily dominated by California. And that's just really a function of the US residential solar market, which similarly is dominated by California. And so that's just something that's important to keep in mind as we go through the presentation and compare solar adopters to the overall US population, that there is sort of this kind of embedded skew associated with the disproportionate share of solar adopters that are in California. One other thing that I want to mention here, I should have mentioned it at the outset, but that's important to be clear about, and that's that our data set here and our analysis is really focused solely on residential rooftop or customer sited residential systems. So we're not looking at community solar here. I just want to be clear about that. All right, so with all of that introductory stuff out of the way, let's look at some results. So here we see Some of the more basic and kind of fundamental findings from the study. The first is simply that PV adopters reflect a broad diversity of different income levels. They're not exclusively, or for that matter, even primarily wealthy households, depending on your definition. That being said, PV adopters do tend to skew relatively high in terms of income compared to the broader population. In the median case, which we show in the figure inserted on the upper right-hand side, PV adopters have a median income, or had a median income of 113,000 in 2019, and that compares to 64,000 median income for the U.S. population, or for U.S. households overall. Now, part of that difference is due to home ownership. Having a PV system on your rooftop in most circumstances basically requires that you own your own home. And so when we can compare PV adopter incomes to incomes just of owner-occupied households, that gap shrinks a little bit. The median income of owner-occupied households, as you can see, was $74,000 a year, but still a sizable gap. Part of the gap also, of course, has to do with the California factor that I mentioned as well, which household incomes in California generally are relatively high. And so the fact that a disproportionate fraction of solar adopters in California are from California is also kind of partially skewing that trend. But even when we control for these different issues like home ownership and the geographical distribution of solar adopters, there is kind of this enduring skew that remains. So throughout much of the remainder of the document, we'll talk about incomes in relative terms, where we basically just express solar adopter incomes as a percentage of the broader population median income. And so values larger than 100% indicate a skew towards higher income households. And you can do this comparison based on different geographical scales. In general, the smaller the geographical scale of the comparison population, the smaller the skew. And you can see that in the figure here as we kind of march to the right. Going forward throughout the rest of the presentation and the report, we generally use the area median income as kind of the benchmark for defining these relative incomes. And when we do that, we also take household size into account. So for each solar adopter, we're comparing their income to the median income of households of the same size in the same area. And so you'll see many figures as we go forward that kind of express incomes in those terms. So one of the other basic central themes that recur through this report and the previous one is that the income skew that I've just mentioned has been declining over time. We see that both in absolute terms in the figure on the top and in relative terms in the figure on the bottom. The numbers here are sort of national, but the same general trend tends to persist at the state level as well. And as I mentioned, we're not kind of in the business within the context of this report of really kind of dissecting these trends and identifying exactly what has driven this downward slope. But there are a few kind of obvious factors that likely play some role. First and foremost is that PV has gotten cheaper over the last 10 years. And so certainly it's becoming more accessible to a broader swath of the population. Opportunities for financing have also become more widespread, and that can be particularly important for kind of lower and more moderate income households that may not have the cash on hand to purchase a system outright. Solar markets are also just maturing in various ways that may tend to broaden uptake into lower income segments. And then especially over the last few years, we've seen a lot of interest among policymakers and program administrators in developing programs and initiatives that aim specifically to expand solar adoption into lower income segments. And we see all of these factors manifesting both in terms of a deepening of the solar market, so kind of increasing levels of adoption, reaching into kind of lower income tiers within existing PV markets, as well as a broadening of solar adoption into parts of the country that previously may not have had much adoption. So solar adopter income levels vary quite a bit across states. Looking at this data in absolute terms, which are the bars in the figure here, some of those differences obviously just reflect more general differences in income levels across states. So states where in general households have high incomes, the solar adopters in those states also tend to have high incomes as well. And so for that reason, it's maybe a little bit more instructive to look at the relative incomes of solar adopters in each state. Those are the dots in the figure here. And still there you see a fairly substantial level of variation. To be sure, all states show some positive skew. So solar adoption across the board in all states does tend to skew high in terms of income levels, but that skew can vary quite a bit from, say, 15 to 20% higher than median incomes at the lower end on the right-hand side, up to maybe 40% higher than median incomes on the left-hand side of the figure. And some of those differences reflect kind of broad policy and programmatic factors, characteristics of the solar markets in different states, as well as just larger macro kind of structural drivers within each state related to overall income levels and kind of income inequity within each state. So one of the first slides that I presented really kind of zeroed in on this issue of the distribution of solar adopters across income levels. And so I want to kind of return to that theme, but home in on the low to moderate income kind of end of the spectrum. And there are a few different ways that LMI can be defined, though it's often specified based on some percentage threshold relative either to AMI or to the federal poverty level, FPL. And so what we've done here is just to provide the breakdown of solar adopters each year into different AMI and FPL based buckets. And you can see that across the board, LMI shares of US solar adopters are generally trending up over time. So larger fractions of new solar adopters each year are within these kind of lower and more moderate income ranges. So that's trending up. And just to provide a couple relevant benchmarks, when we look at adopters in 2019, 21% had incomes below 80% of AMI, and that's a threshold that's often used in kind of low-income energy programs to define eligibility. And about twice that amount, 42% of solar adopters in 2019 were below 120% of AMI, which you might think about as maybe representing not just low, but also low and moderate income levels. So here we see the same breakdown on a state-by-state basis. I won't really say much about this other than just to state the obvious that there's quite a bit of variation in LMI shares across states, no doubt reflecting some of the same kinds of factors that I alluded to a couple slides ago. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Sydney, who is going to walk us through the rest of the presentation. Sydney,
yeah, thanks,
it's all
Galen.
you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So Galen just ran through some of these relative income trends across time and states. We also looked at some of these trends by various market segments. And so first, we looked at third-party ownership. Second, we looked at differences across solar installers. Third, we looked at battery attachment. And fourth, we looked at multifamily. And so all of these analyses were done with various subsets of the data. So the first three of the single family data, and more information on that is in the report. So next slide. Yeah, so getting into the third-party systems. So what we see here is that there's fairly consistently lower incomes in third-party adopters, both in absolute terms up at the top and also in relative terms in this middle figure when compared to host-owned systems. And while we don't show it here, these trends also exist at the state level. And this is also consistent with findings from our colleague Eric O'Shaughnessy, who had a paper in Nature Energy earlier this calendar year. So you can see here in this bottom figure that the share of third-party ownership systems have fluctuated quite a bit in this past decade, going from near zero to slightly over half of our system sample in 2012, remaining fairly flat till 2016, where it has started to decrease. So this could in part explain some of the flattening trend that Galen showed of the adopters' migration to lower incomes. And again, Eric's paper does dive a little bit deeper into those data. So moving on to installer level trends. When we look at installers, we see similar trends with the rest of the data in general, in that it does cover a large range of incomes, and also that all of these incomes skew relatively high. If you look at this top figure at the very far left side, you see a couple below this 100% AMI baseline. And those are actually 8 different installers on this far left-hand side. And I guess good to note here that all of the installers that do aim to directly serve low to moderate income customers are part of this group. So Galen did mention that there are different programs that are specifically targeting these communities, and we do see that they do represent lower income adopters. So looking at this lower figure here, we see that across all ownership models, as installers get larger, the median income of adopters does decrease. And we think that this could be because of more third-party ownership options. However, when we do break it into host-owned versus third-party systems and look at how size impacts adopter income, we do see that trend break up a little bit. But you can just see in the relative size of the bars that third-party ownership adopters do generally have lower incomes than those of host-owned adopters. So moving right along to storage attachment. So one quick note here is that for this analysis, we just looked at storage co-adoption. So this does not cover systems where batteries were added to an existing PV system. So again, just co-adoption. And this makes up a very small percentage of our sample, around 4% in 2019. But an additional data collection does show that this rate is growing. And also, we do see that solar plus storage systems have a 30% premium. So that makes sense that we see higher income adopters in this space, though at a slightly smaller proportion of around 22%. And while this trend varies across geographies, we do find that this increased income does hold for all the states that we had information for, though at varying levels, you can see here on this left-hand side. So in looking at multifamily adopters, another quick note here is that Galen did mention this up top, but we are not talking about community solar here. We're talking about homeowner occupied multifamily housing. So this represents more like condos, and we're not really getting into that tenant landlord split or community solar. But this makes up an even smaller percentage of our solar systems, roughly 2% of our 2019 sample. And we see here that across all households that we had data for, they fall into that 100% AMI baseline range. So this would be in that category of moderate income. And this is true across most states, but you can see some differences when you go from state to state. And especially when you look at the comparison with the single family adopters, you can see how much lower those incomes of multifamily adopters actually are. And while we have incomplete data on program participation, we did want to note that many of these adopters did seem to adopt independent of incentive programs for low to moderate income participants. So shifting from income to other demographic and socioeconomic trends, we look at a slew of different variables, and this is also where we have a large expansion from our last report that Galen mentioned earlier. So we cover credit scores, education level, occupation, and then when looking at the neighborhoods of the solar adopters, we look at rurality and race and ethnicity. When we do have information on age and home value, and while we're not covering it in this presentation, we can answer questions about it during Q&A, or it is also available in the report itself. And two broad takeaways before diving in. We did see a consistent trend that Galen also showed us earlier, where solar adopters do exhibit a skew, but over time they more closely resemble the broader population. And this could be the fact that some of these variables are correlated to income and can lead to somewhat parallel trends. So getting into credit scores first. The quick note here is a bunch of quick notes. And again, for more information, it's in the report. But the quick note here is that due to data privacy, we just have information on the zip +4. So this is the very direct neighborhood of the adopter and not necessarily the adopter itself. But even so, you see that the close neighborhood around solar adopters show far higher credit scores than the broader US population. So those warmer tones in this figure are prime and above, and the cooler tones are subprime. And this could be due to a couple of things. For example, home ownership or credit scores required for third-party ownership or other financing options for PV could either lead to or necessitate higher FICO scores. But also, again, similarly, we do see that this trend has diminished over time and has flattened since around 2016, but you still see that big skew towards super prime FICO scores and away from these higher risk FICO scores. So this is one of the new variables we looked at. And here we compared the census homeowner or householder education level with that of the education level of the highest known education level of the PV adopter. And so what we see here is that similar to other trends, solar adopters span all levels, but the skew does exist towards those that at least a bachelor's and away from those with a high school diploma or less. And similarly with other trends, again, this is diminishing. This has sort of flattened over time, and it's starting to look more like the US population. So for occupation, here, the quick note is that we aggregate occupations to match the groupings in the US Bureau of Labor Statistics for comparison. And we do see adoption across all categories similarly. And one thing to note here is that there is a skew towards business and financial occupations and away from blue collar positions. However, especially for blue collar occupations, this skew has diminished over time, and you do see a big increase from 2010 to 2019. So moving into the PV adopters communities. First, we looked at the rurality of adopters, and here it depends greatly on what you select as the comparison population. So overall, we do see that adopters come from states that are generally more urban than the US as a whole. However, within those states, the communities that they come from may look either more or less rural than their state as a whole. So zooming back out to talk about these figures, 14% of the adopters fall into rural areas, whereas the US rural population makes up 19% of the country. And this time trend you can see here does show some fluctuation. So the bottom figure shows state level comparisons, and you can see that those with the upward facing bars show states where PV adopters are more rural than their state population, and those with downward bars are less rural. So actually, when you look at this figure here, you do see that PV adopters compared to their state populations can actually be more rural. So again, it really depends. And another new variable we looked at was the race and ethnicity of the PV adopters block group. So again, this is not household level. What we did here was we compared the population of block groups that PV adopters fell in versus the population of their respective state block groups as a whole, which are the X and the Y axes respectively. So the size of the circles here represent the solar adopter sample size. And so those towards the lower right-hand corner indicate that solar adopters fall in block groups with relatively higher non-Hispanic white population, and vice versa towards the upper left. So overall, we do see most of the bubbles in that lower right-hand corner, indicating that adopters do tend to reside in whiter block groups. And when we break it out, next slide, when we break out that non-white population into Hispanic, non-Hispanic Asian, and non-Hispanic Black, we do see that the bubbles cluster in the upper left-hand corner for the Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black populations, which indicate that solar adopters tend to fall into block groups with relatively less Hispanic and less Black populations compared to their state. And in the non-Hispanic Asian case, you do see sort of a distribution on either side of that dotted line, but they do tend to overall break a little bit towards the lower right-hand corner, showing a slight increase in PV adopters in Asian block groups compared to their state. So a quick note is that we show these trends nationally in the report, and the trends do change. The big note here is that this huge circle here is California. It represents around half of our sample size. And so even though California has fewer adopters in non-white block groups, the fact that they have such a high Asian and Hispanic population and that they make up such a large portion of our sample shows that, or it leads to PV adopters as a whole looking more Hispanic and non-Hispanic Asian than the US population as a whole. And the quick thing to note there is that non-Hispanic Black populations are underrepresented whether or not you look at state or US population as a whole. So quickly moving on to conclusions, this was a lot of information, and it's hard to boil everything down into a few bullets, but we try to do so here. So the first takeaway is that solar adopters are heterogeneous in terms of their income and their demographics. They also tend to diverge from the US general population in many ways. The skews that we presented here show skews towards higher income, both in absolute and relative terms, more urban and also more educated households. And we did see that those differences are diminishing over time with a slight flattening in recent years. We also see that the degree of disparity between solar adopters and the broader population varies significantly across states, and you can actually see opposite trends in one place versus another. And also, as we do get more and more granular with our geographic scope, you do see that this skew does reduce as you get more and more local. And finally, we did mention up top that this is a descriptive analysis. So further analysis is needed to better understand the underlying dynamics. So things like different interactions or around the effects of policy interventions that are aimed at addressing the low to moderate income population, for example. And while we do some of this, we also hope that this report and these data do serve as a good base for others in the space who are looking into these issues. And thank you all for your time. We have quite a bit of time for Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Sydney. Thanks, Galen. This is Naeem Darguth, and I am looking at some of the questions that are coming in and remind you to go ahead and use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar to enter any questions you may have. So there was a question, I think, in their introductory remarks, as well as Sydney, you just mentioned that acknowledging that the paper is mainly about descriptive analysis, but there's planned or ongoing work kind of looking maybe more statistically into some of the underlying reasons as to why we're seeing the trends we see. So there was a question about what our plans are to kind of dig into that work, the more statistical work, and what kinds of methods we may be using.
I can take that, or take the first cut at that, and you two can chime in as well. So yeah, I mean, at this point, so we have kind of one paper that Sydney alluded to that has been out for a little while. This was a paper that Eric led and that all of us were somehow involved in, and it involved evaluating the effectiveness of different policy and business interventions at stimulating higher levels of adoption among LMI households. And that paper looks specifically at third-party ownership, at PACE financing, and at incentive programs that are kind of geared specifically, or with eligibility rules that are limited specifically to lower income households. And so that's some work that we've done, kind of looking at the impact of those specific policy interventions. We also have some work that Eric's been leading, looking at sort of the supply side and trying to understand the behavior of PV installers in terms of whether and how they differentiate the number of quotes that they issue to customers in lower income neighborhoods versus higher income neighborhoods, and any differences in kind of the close rates of quotes that are provided to customers for systems in those neighborhoods. So that's kind of focusing on the supply side of the equation, and that's work that has been submitted to a journal and hopefully will be made available to the public, you know, as soon as it works its way through that peer review process. There are a couple other papers that are in the pipeline. One is a meta evaluation of evaluations that have been performed for low-income solar programs. This is some work that a colleague of ours, Ben Paulos, has led, and that really just kind of, as the description I gave indicates, involves looking at how those programs have been evaluated, and including some comparisons to the energy efficiency program space, and kind of assessing kind of current and best practices related to program evaluation. So that paper should be coming out anytime, I believe. There's some other work that some colleagues of ours, Jeff Deason and Greg Leventis and Sean Murphy, have been doing with the Clean Energy States Alliance and Connecticut Green Bank to evaluate Connecticut Green Bank's low-income solar financing program, and kind of looking at the financial performance of that program. I believe that work will be coming out and being published kind of any day now as well. So that's all stuff that is either out or will soon be out. Beyond that, you know, we've got some project ideas that are in the hopper, though I think, you know, none of it is necessarily set in stone at this point. I think we're pretty sure we're going to do some work around energy burden, kind of looking at the role and impact of distributed solar in addressing energy burdens, and kind of how those impacts may vary across income levels. So that's something in the hopper as well. And then, you know, beyond that, I think we have sort of a laundry list of project ideas, and it's just a matter of kind of prioritizing and working our way through them.
Great, thanks. So there's a couple of questions on state-specific results, and so maybe that is a good segue or introduction to the tool, and explaining a little bit more what the online tool is and how one could use that tool to get state-specific results.
Yeah, so I think Naeem linked to the tool itself, and also a quick 5-minute tutorial that Eric O'Shaughnessy pulled together at the top of this presentation, but they're also available via the main page, the landing page for all of this work. And essentially any of the income specific trends, both over time and over geographies, can be found there. The tool provides data down to the tract level where there is a large enough sample to provide. And visually, we do show the information, the different trends down to the county level. But if you're just interested in state or national level, those are also available as well. So again, the tool is fairly easy to use, especially with the help of that tutorial, and can be found on the landing page for this work.
Great. There are a couple of questions related to whether there's any evidence that higher low-income adoption rates exist in states with more generous subsidies or more generous LMI-specific subsidies.
So we haven't sort of done that analysis on a state-by-state basis, but the paper that I alluded to earlier and that Sydney mentioned, that Eric had kind of led, I mean, it shows pretty clearly that third-party ownership and to a lesser extent PACE financing, but then also low-income solar programs, kind of means qualifying kind of incentive programs, that those are effective at driving higher levels of adoption. And so I think it stands to reason that states where those mechanisms exist will tend, all else being equal, to see higher levels of LMI adoption. But we haven't yet, though I think this is something we would are interested in doing. We haven't really looked at the state level variation and tried to decompose that in terms of the underlying drivers, whether those are policy related or just related to kind of larger macro kind of structural issues or differences across states.
Yeah, in that paper, it covers 5 different policy and business models. So it covers financial incentives, LMI specific financial incentives, system leasing, PACE, and solarized campaigns. And again, that's a Nature Energy paper that can be found on the landing page.
Thanks. So a question, so you mentioned that there were some other characteristics that you looked at and not presented today in the webinar. What were those other characteristics, and are there any kind of findings you can summarize here?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So there were kind of two kind of sets of trends that we omitted from the presentation here today. The first is looking at the age of solar adopters, really the age of the primary household member. And that's what the chart here shows. So, as you can see, and we compare kind of the age distribution of solar adopters to all US householders. And so a couple maybe sort of high level things to note here. First, solar adopters do skew somewhat older than the broader population. Those differences really primarily come down to that youngest age group, the 25 to 35-year-old group, which are underrepresented among solar adopters. And that's maybe not entirely surprising given lower home ownership rates and lower income levels typically of households in that age range. Aside from that, though, the other maybe interesting thing to note is what's happening at the top end of the chart, where you can see over time an increasing share of solar adoption among the kind of older than 65-year-old grouping, which maybe is sort of a stand-in for retirees, though I'm not sure if people are necessarily retiring at age 65 anymore. But that, I think, that's an interesting trend and kind of makes sense, thinking about over time as PV has become sort of a more established technology. Retirees on fixed incomes may be increasingly viewing solar as sort of a a viable and maybe even a financially advantageous investment. And so that may be kind of partly what we're seeing at the top end of the chart here. So that was one thing that we omitted from the presentation, though now we are presenting it. And then the other is this figure here, which compares, which shows the home value of solar adopters. And the metric here requires a little bit of explanation. What the data that we have is not the sort of actual or estimated home value in kind of dollar terms, but rather the data that we have for each PV adopter is the home value as a county percentile. So what percentile among all homes in the county does that home value fall within? And so you can see that home values of solar adopters do skew high. They're greater than the 50th percentile. But that skew has diminished over time, as we see, with all of the other trends that we're looking at. And it's, sort of converged, I suppose, to more or less resemble the same skew that we see in income when focusing just on owner-occupied households, which is kind of the more relevant subsegment to be comparing to. And I think, maybe what is useful about this metric is that it, looking at home value provides sort of a window into household wealth as distinct from income. That's of course, wealth only for households that own their own home. So we're, obviously missing a huge swath of the population by only focusing on home value. But there may be reasons that wealth in some cases may be a more useful indicator or may tell a different story than just focusing on income itself. So this is the other piece that we had left out of the presentation but are covering now.
Great, thanks. So there was a question about the largest LMI markets in the country, and if we've identified any particular states that are particularly good at reaching LMI populations.
Well, I don't know if we've necessarily identified states that are good at it, but this figure here shows at least which states have achieved the highest sort of representation among LMI households within the population of solar adopters. And so just, kind of if we wanted to say pick, 80% of AMI as sort of the threshold of interest. So that's kind of the second darkest bar here. You can see that varies across states, but there are a few like Connecticut, for example, DC, Kansas, that have relatively high proportions of solar adopters that fall within those kind of lower income bands. And we haven't done the work to really assess why that is or to attribute those differences to specific policies. Some of it may have to do with kind of programmatic efforts. I mentioned this work that some colleagues have been doing with the Connecticut Green Bank, and Connecticut has been, among the most active states in really trying to support solar adoption among LMI households. So that programs and policies may be part of the story, but just sort of background income levels can be part of it as well. And so with DC, for example, so the area, the statistical area that DC falls within is actually larger than the footprint of the district itself, and it encompasses some fairly wealthy suburbs surrounding DC. And so median incomes, the area median income for DC is actually quite high. And for that reason, a fairly large percentage of solar adopters fall within sort of lower percentages of AMI, if that makes sense. So the benchmark that we're comparing it to is much higher. So it's it's easier for households that are in sort of that are below 100% or below 80% of AMI to afford PV because that AMI level is so high. So point being that it's both a matter of policy and a matter of just kind of the background kind of income levels within each state.
Great. So I think that's the end of all Q&As that have been submitted. So we may be able to give you 8 minutes back and end the webinar a few minutes early.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Naeem. So maybe just to kind of close things out, I wanted to bring us to the last slide here and just point you all towards a few places where you can gather some additional information if you like. So obviously feel free to contact any of us. You can also see some URLs listed here, one for our groups or department's main publication page, another for our mailing list. So we won't spam you, or we'll try not to spam you, but if you do want to receive information about future webinars and future publications, the easiest way to do that is to sign up on our mailing list. So definitely encourage you to do that. And then we also have a Twitter handle, which is another channel through which we will publicize our work. So if you're on Twitter, you can follow us there. And then lastly, I did just want to thank our funders at the Department of Energy within the Solar Energy Technologies Office for supporting this work, and also members of our project advisory group. This is a small select group of organizations and individuals, the Clean Energy States Alliance, Posigen, Grid Alternatives, and Paulos Analytics, who have been advising us throughout the process of developing these work products, and have provided a lot of helpful input along the way. So I wanted to thank all of them as well. And then lastly, just thank all of you for joining the webinar today. We appreciate you tuning in. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we will see you next time. All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.